Welcome to the World Cup mood board, semi-finals day. Jarrod Kimber for 99.94. All right, let us start with New Zealand batting because that's literally where we have it first on the script. I don't want to pretend that there's too much pre-planning here, but we're just going to go through all the different teams, have a bit of a chat about them. We'll probably have a slightly different kind of review tomorrow as well, maybe slightly more analytical and coming out from a different angle. But as you can see, there's a lot of New Zealand players here. So let's talk about New Zealand batters. I think they decided to trick everyone at the start of this World Cup. The start of the real World Cup, anyway, by making a lot of runs and making us think that it was just the poor qualifiers that couldn't score any runs. It turned out New Zealand's 200 against Australia was still not exactly how the tournament was going to go. So Devon Conway is someone else who he made 92 from 58 in that game, and if you remember, it looked really good. I thought he played Adam Zampa particularly well, and to be fair, Adam Zampa's had a really good World Cup, I think, outside of that game. Since then, Conway has made 32 runs in 3 games, and if you have a look at it, and I can't find it, it doesn't look particularly good in this way. I think for me, the thing I've been more worried about is that he hasn't looked particularly good against off spin, which is usually a real strength of Devon Conway, and he's just looked a little bit muddled at times. Which again, I think when we think of Conway, we're talking about a late blooming cricketer, took a long time to work out his game, knows what he's doing. He hasn't looked like that sure-footed player that we saw early on in the tournament anyway. Obviously, Kane Williamson has been a problem as well, but he did make runs in that last game against Ireland, and I think more importantly, he showed intent. Oh, that's the buzzword, isn't it? But also hit the ball very hard. So those are the two things we worry about. Intent is always his problem because he likes to go slower than other players. But also because of that elbow, we weren't sure if he could actually, hit through the line. And apparently he did in the last game. And there were some really good power shots there. So you can match that up with Finn Allen and I suppose Glenn Phillips, who's been the best player in this tournament so far. Best batter in this tournament so far for New Zealand. Only Kohli and Sky scored more runs than him in the Super 12. So certainly there's something to be said about those 4 players. They've got the same problem that a lot of teams do. They have Asantna at number 7, although they do have Mitchell just before him, but Mitchell hasn't quite looked like the Mitchell that we've seen in the last year or so as he's coming back from injury. But Santner at 7, it's one of those things that never really works on paper. But the way that New Zealand bat, it's very rare that it seems to fall apart for them. And they do have Bracewell if they want to bring in, but clearly they do not. In a tournament favoured, let's go on to the bowling. In a tournament favoured by new ball bowling, you're going to be shocked. But New Zealand have unsurprisingly enjoyed themselves so far in that. Just waiting. Let's have a look here. Yeah. And I think it's the Australia game when they bowled them out for 111. Also when they bowled Sri Lanka out for 102. The only thing that I find very interesting, let me just bring this one up, is the amount of bowlers they've used in this tournament. This is total bowlers used by each team. I think this is just from Super 12s onwards. I think. Oh no, it might be all the teams. West Indies in there too. You can see that they've used the least amount of bowlers in the tournament so far. There's always 2 ways to look at this. 1, everything's going great, so they don't need to change. 2, if something does happen, no one else is really in the groove, particularly. What is interesting is that they haven't used, Glenn Phillips' spin and those other sorts of options that they might have. Daryl Mitchell bowling a couple of overs of medium pace. Everything has just worked so well for them so far that it is quite interesting, especially with Bracewell and Milne just out of the side. Nisham in the side as well. So they have other options, but so far it's all gone the way that they want it to. Let's just have a look at all the bowlers have been in the wicket. So Bolt and Sodhi have 6. Ferguson and Sodhi have 7, and Santner has 8 so far. So it's certainly been quite well spread as well. And 3 of the 5 have just been going at barely more than a run a ball. Ferguson is going at 8.1, which is weird because it's not particularly something that happens to him a lot. Bolt's going at 7.2 as well. Part of that would just be the added workload of them bowling at the death. But only England have managed to make more than 150 against New Zealand so far in this tournament. And it would be hard to say that this is not a strength of New Zealand, considering what has happened with the facilities. But also, their spinners have bowled quite well compared to some of the others. It might just be the pitches they've played on compared to other teams. But it's a very strong unit for them. If we just go on and have a look at how the ground might affect them. So Sydney's been a high-scoring ground so far in this tournament. Both of the scores of 200 coming in there. Of course, one of those was actually made by New Zealand as well. And they've also managed to bowl out teams quite cheaply at this venue. So 111 and 102, as we talked about before. England versus Sri Lanka was played at this venue. It is worth talking about that game just because that was a thrice-used pitch. And the only match at the ground in which at least one side did make 167. So we're probably looking at the moment that it's already the equal highest runs per over of any venue in the World Cup. And with a fresh pitch, you probably assume it would be even more so. New Zealand batters' reliability to produce a big score is probably something that they can use to their advantage here. They do have the ability, I think, to maybe not out-bat Pakistan out of the game, but certainly put on the sort of total that will put a lot of pressure on Pakistan's top order specifically, and then that middle order as well if they do lose any wickets. So far in this tournament, spin has been more economical and had a better average than pace at the SCG. It's going at 6.8 runs and over there. Some of that will be the reused wickets, of course, but some of it's just the SCG. Pace has been going at 8.2 runs, and there's been a bowling average of 19 for the spinners. So again, for a team that is, and this won't give New Zealand a huge advantage because I think both teams have good new ball bowling and good spin options. But for New Zealand, that's not going to be particularly a big problem there. It's obviously hard to predict how anyone lines up against Pakistan directly because Pakistan is Pakistan, but. We know that the Pakistan opening batters have not turned up at this tournament so far, and New Zealand's power play bowling has been completely on song. That feels like a really good matchup for New Zealand to come into this game. Cube, Bubba and Rizwan making 80 each, but it does feel at least that that's a really good matchup as it currently stands for New Zealand. Pakistan seamers have been their biggest threat throughout this tournament, and New Zealand have been striking at 145 against pace in the last year. However, the Black Caps' average against spin is actually higher than against pace, so I think they'll feel reasonably confident with Pakistan's leading wicket taker, Shadab Khan, as well. But it'll be interesting to see some of the individual matchups there. Let's move on to Pakistan. Their batting just... As we said, they're a top order team where the top order has not turned up. It's really, really bad. Rizwan has 103 runs and Baba has 39 runs off 25 balls. 39 runs and 25 of those came against Bangladesh yesterday. And he averages 7.8 in the tournament. And if you're unaware, 7.8 is a bad thing to average. If you just have a look at this is Cricinfo's match impact rating. As an indication of how awful his tournament has been, he's currently the bottom of Cricinfo's MVP ratings with an impact match rating of minus 3.1 and a total impact of minus 15. For context, the median player in those rankings is Luke Jongwei with an impact rating of 12.8 and a total impact of 77. Now, Luke Jongwei didn't really do much in this tournament. He was sort of way too low down the order to get too much of a bat with Zimbabwe. They didn't bowl him that much either. He was kind of there in case they needed extra seam bowling. And I suppose he probably slightly shored up their batting further on down the order. You don't really want to be in a situation where you're miles off Luke Jongwei, I think is the best way of pointing it. And we know how bad Bubba has been, but it did, to be fair, it just looks slightly better when you show it like this. The other way of looking at it, of course, is he's a fantastic player and he's due. That's how I would look at it if I was a Pakistani fan anyway. Shan Masood offers some backup if their openers continue to struggle, which is kind of why he was brought in. We've got Mohamed Harris exploding. I actually think Mohamed Harris is, I think I talked about this yesterday. I'd rather see him split up the two openers. Maybe they don't feel they need to do that with Shan Masood, but I really like the idea of going about that. It's still there's still a lot of good talent in there, and there's some power, obviously, later on. It just doesn't feel like it's completely working at the moment. All right. They're bowling. They are a bowling team. But that's kind of why they employ their openers to bat as long as possible. And to be fair, their bowlers were a Virat Kohli masterclass away from winning the game against India. They probably should have won the game against Zimbabwe. Skittled the Netherlands. They were too much for South Africa, and they pulled Bangladesh back in. They've been fantastic. Shaheen Afridi hasn't been in magic Shaheen Afridi form just yet, but he certainly looked a lot better against Bangladesh, which is a hell of a time to be finding your rhythm. Mohammad Wasim has bowled really well as well. Haris Rauf has gone at 6.8 runs and over, and I mentioned that because he's the most expensive of all those bowlers. Shadab Khan has picked up wickets. I think he's got 10 wickets, but it's the times at which he's found them. He's also managed to quite often cluster them as one or two in an over. So when he has got wickets, it's had quite an impact so far. Look, they looked a little bit vulnerable with their second spinner, although to be fair, Mohammad Nawaz is also a seam bowler now, so what flexibility they have there. But he's only bowled the 7 overs in the 5 games. They haven't really needed that second spinner so far. It is the SCG. Things might change slightly because of that. Although if it is a fresh pitch, I don't think spin's going to be the biggest thing. But it will be interesting to see if they continue to back the pace as they have so far, considering the conditions here. Pakistan have played 1 game at the SCG so far, and it was probably their most complete performance of the tournament. It was also where they actually batted their best. Although for a team who struggled with batting consistency, the fact that it's been a fairly high-scoring ground may count against them. Equally, on grounds where run scoring is a little bit easier, the value of high-quality bowlers is multiplied, and obviously Pakistan has an absolute bunch of those. Because pace has been less successful at the ground, that's where we come back to what we were talking about a moment with their bowlers. At the moment, they've been leaning towards pace, but that might also just be conditions-based of the tournament itself as much as anything else. And now they're at the SCG, they might change the idea there. Pakistan's bowling attack matches up fairly well with New Zealand. Even if they're not, maybe as well-rounded in the spin department, depending on how much Nawaz is going to bowl. But there's 4 right-handers in New Zealand's top 6. And also, I know that Conway played well against Zampa early in this tournament, but my memory is that Conway's not particularly the best left-hander against a leg spin as well. So if Nawaz might come into that with bowling, spinning the ball away from the right-handers, and then with Shadab as well. So it'd be interesting to see how they go about that. And New Zealand, it might be a lot more, it's weird to say this, but reliable at the moment, although, as we know, Pakistan has been incredibly reliant. But the one thing I would say is that despite the fact that New Zealand's batting, Conway and Mitchell have been in interesting form of recent times, and we don't know where Williamson is. Having Conway, Mitchell, and Williamson in that side, if Pakistan seam bowlers do get on one, I think is pretty cool. And there's no real respite for the Pakistan players when it comes to the spinners. They might attack Sodhi. But on a slightly bigger surface with a little bit of assistance for him, that could be a little bit dangerous. But there's no real weakness for Pakistan to attack with the bat. So there's the first game. We'll try and take a slightly different kind of look at that tomorrow. But let's move on to the second game, which is India versus England, which is a really, really fascinating. They're both fascinating, actually, but they're fascinating in 2 different ways in that Pakistan and New Zealand were not particularly favoured coming in. Whereas England and India were. But at the moment, I'm not sure how you feel about any of those teams. We've seen all the teams play some good cricket, but it's not like the last semi-finals where Pakistan and England looked absolutely incredible coming into them. This time, everyone's showing their weaknesses, the different pitches and everything else. So India versus England. So let's start with India's batting. they've obviously had the odd occasional scary moment so far against Pakistan and South Africa, but I think they've looked pretty solid, all things considered. Virat Kohli and Sky, almost said his real name there, perished the thought. They're the first and third highest run scorers in the tournament. That always worries me coming into semi-finals. I always go back to the Shane Watson incident in 2012 World Cup where he carried Australia all the way through. And then they got to a point where he failed in the semi-final and they really struggled. It's not something you can really account for, especially in this short tournament. And there are certainly, it's not like they are a two-person batting group, of course. But when you do have two players scoring that much, it means quite a few of the others haven't made as many runs. But I wouldn't be particularly worried about that. Let me just have a look. Where's my runs going? Yeah. So the other interesting thing is that they've scored so much. If you look at the other players in that top 6, 7, in the top 7, you'll see that everyone else played in the group games. So even if you're, have any concerns that the majority of your runs have come from two players, they've also done it in just a couple of games so far. So, the sheer weight of runs in this situation, I think, is absolutely huge for them. And I think the entire top 4 has made half centuries at some point in this tournament. KL Rahul has them in the last 2 games, so he's probably not too far away from these top run scorers now as well. So I think from that perspective, there's runs in that top order, and I suppose Pakistan put them under pressure. The South Africa, in some ways, I think that's almost ideal. You've got KL Rahul's made a little bit of runs. You've got 2 guys who've made a lot of runs. And then you've got the fact that they have actually been under pressure by really good bowling attacks at times. So it's not one of those situations where they haven't really had any stress test. They've had the stress test and they've done quite well at times there. Let's have a look. Elsewhere, the replacement of the injured Dinesh Karthik with Rishabh Pant. It depends on how you look at it. This is a tournament in which Dinesh Karthik's batting should be more important than Rishabh Pant's. And I'll tell you why specifically. It's because we've seen a lot of teams chip the ball around for a long time and then go ballistic at the death. And that is obviously what Dinesh Karthik is in this team for. The problem with that is that Dinesh Karthik has probably had to be pulled into the innings far earlier because of the extra wickets. So I think Rishabh Pant he's a better player and he's more important. I'm not sure he has a better role than Dinesh Karthik, but I don't think they're losing anything by having him in this particular team. Obviously, it's hard to find a major weakness in their order, but any top order, and they are a top order dependent batting lineup. Who's the only team that's probably not is England of the 4 semi-finalists. Everyone else really needs their top 4 to do the majority of the work, just because they have batting weaknesses coming in later on, or they just don't have the depth of the all-round talent all the way through. But considering all that, I think India's been pretty well road tested in a way where they were never under pressure that they were going to miss out on the semi-finals as well, but that they had to go up against good attacks. If we look at their bowling, it's probably been their weaker suit. Obviously, Jasprit Bumrah would change that. Jadeja gives them flexibility as well. But Harshdeep Singh has just been so fantastic at times in this tournament. I've talked about him a lot. I remember his breakthrough year, which I can't remember what actual season that was. And sometimes you see a young Indian bowler come through and they have like a breakthrough year in the IPL. And you're like, yeah, I can see why they've taken wickets, but this isn't going to last. People are going to work them out. And I had him as a potential one of those bowlers. And it's interesting just how much. And then a couple of years after that, when he was still hanging around, and I remember watching him one day and he was bowling his cutters, and I could see how much sideways movement and dip he was getting on his cutters. And I was like, well, if he can do that as well as be fairly accurate and be a left-arm bowler, he's got something. Now, he's just been brilliant at not just swinging the new ball in one direction, but swinging it in both directions. And I've talked about this before. Left-arm seam bowlers don't generally swing the ball in both directions. That on its own is a magical skill to have, plus of everything else that he has here. He's taken 10 wickets, and he's also been handy at the death. I'm not sure he's been outstanding there. But that ability, I think I might have talked about this very early on in the tournament. If you look at India's bowling attack and you look at the way this tournament fell into place, they ended up with an ideal bowling attack with it. Because essentially they have guys who can really use the new ball and also guys who can hit the seam. And that's what these pitches have been about so far is, obviously swing is always an advantage no matter where you bowl, but a little bit of seam as well. And, having someone like Mohammad Shami in that, it's fallen into place. It would still be better with Jasprit Bumrah, obviously. But the fact that they have two swing bowlers who can both swing the ball in two different directions, I can't think of another bowling attack in T20 cricket where that is a skill set that anyone has. And before this, I wouldn't have even flagged it up as something that interesting. But the more I look at it, I just think it's really hard to line them up without losing a couple of wickets along the way. But Bhuvi's been incredible again. He's bowled 3 maidens so far in this tournament, has an economy of 5.4. I did a video on Bhuvi recently where I said that I thought the comments that he was past his best were a little bit silly when you looked at his record. I think he's just a bowler who needs to be probably more fully fit than anyone else. I don't know if the one thing I would say about India's bowlers is that I'm not sure that they've been fully tested all the way through this tournament. If you have a look at perhaps the Pakistan game was one, I'm not sure we've seen them be tested by some of the other batting lineups so far. So that is always going to be tough, especially because their semi-final happens to be against the hardest hitting and deepest batting lineup in the tournament. So that's something I suppose to look out for. This is going to be a very different kind of game than they've had to play so far. In some ways, playing England is a different form of limited overs cricket than any other team, probably since the West Indies were quite similar, just because of that ability to hit sixes all the way down, and they can come at you a lot harder. Whereas every other team will come at you hard, but they might try and build a base first. But it's not been that kind of tournament, and England may not be able to do it. I'm just having a look. What was the game? I suppose they didn't defend 133 against South Africa, but that was a pretty good effort, I would have thought, all things considered, in that game. And I think that it was obvious combination of what happened with South Africa, but I do think that the Indian bowlers did quite well in that game to keep the pressure on. That's kind of what you want from a bowling unit going into the semi-finals. If they can take big snazzy wickets early up front, that's obviously a huge advantage. But the ability to keep the pressure all the way through is also quite important. All right, if you move on to the ground, India have the advantage of having played one game at Adelaide already, the win over Bangladesh. Virat Kohli loves Adelaide, so that's quite cool as well. He has 154 and 229 innings there. Not to mention he has 500 an average of 75.6 there across all formats. The Phil Hughes game, it's one of the best batting performances I've ever seen by a player. Just absolutely incredible across those both innings, and probably, he almost won the game for India from absolutely nowhere. When teams weren't playing on a used wicket there, they've scored fairly well compared to the other grounds so far. India managed 184 against Bangladesh. So it is a decent batting wicket. Pace has actually done better at Adelaide Oval so far than spin, but those numbers it's worth looking at them, and it's certainly something that has happened in this tournament, but it is worth remembering that the way that this tournament has been played, even those numbers themselves are going to be a combination of fresh wickets and used wickets. And that is going to be slightly different. But if you want the numbers, and it's been an average of 28.8 and for pace compared to 23.9 for spin. And the economy's been slightly better for spin, 7.3 to 7.7. So I think it's actually quite interesting that the average for spin is so low. That will be something that, in fact, both teams will be interested in, I would have thought. England's bowling has been better than expected this tournament. However, it's obviously their weakest part of their game, and it matches up with India's informed batting. It should be a very, very interesting thing to see. England have gambled with Stokes early on, who's been swinging the ball around. Woakes has looked patchy at times. Mark Wood and Sam Curran have been exceptional, and they've sort of, Adil Rashid struggled to get some wickets early on. Be very interesting to see how that bowling lineup, which on paper seems kind of, it is accidental, isn't it? It's certainly not their first it's not quite the bowling lineup they would want, and they would prefer Adil Rashid to have been in slightly better form. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes up, because it's essentially India's strength going up against England's weakness from that perspective. And I suppose you kind of feel that way in the opposite as well, where, it's weakness versus strength and strength versus weakness if you look at this semi-final and the way that these teams match up. Let's move on to England, because Muku already has. Coming into this tournament, England's explosive batting lineup was expected to put them in a strong position to win this whole thing. And then they got here and the conditions completely shat on all the ideas that England, and probably, I think England, well, maybe you put West Indies in this as well, but England, West Indies, and Australia are probably the three teams that were set up to smack the ball everywhere and got to this World Cup, and the pitches and the new Kookaburra balls weren't really allowing for that. And it has been a little bit different, which is, I think, something that early on in England's development as a white ball team would have really thrown them. The fact that, and they still lost that game against Ireland, of course, but the fact that they have been able to adapt at times, I think shows that they're a little bit better than. There was a time when they were brilliant at hitting the white ball, but it did feel like it was almost like they were good at hitting throwdowns, if that makes sense. On very flat pitches where not much was happening, they would hit through the line and you couldn't beat them because they would score more runs than you because they had a deeper batting lineup. Anytime there was any variation on that theme, it felt like England really, really struggled. I'm not sure that is quite the situation. And, we still saw it against Ireland, but we then saw, how they went about the Afghanistan chase, which is in some ways a real test for them, and they went massively impressive. But it's also the fact that they won ugly is something that I think has been a progression of England's white ball cricket. We don't know how they would have gone up against Australia, which, means that we don't have as much information on them as possible. And when they played against Sri Lanka, that was on a used wicket that was a little bit tricky. The match against New Zealand is perhaps the best one that we actually have to judge them on. And that was certainly their best game so far in this tournament. However, there's been a sense in the last couple of games that their top order is starting to hit the ball fairly well. And certainly the conditions of Stokes as the backup anchor. Who would have thought Ben Stokes would need to be an anchor, or that would be his job, has been quite handy as well. Look, they're a very deep batting lineup and they like to hit the ball really hard. It would be really fascinating to see them go up against a swing bowling early on. England's bowling in this tournament at the death has been better than expected. I'm trying to rush out a Sam Curran video because I think it's remarkable that he's bowled so well at the death in this tournament so far, considering he's never really done that before. And Mark Wood has been the fastest bowler in the tournament, slightly quicker than Anrik Nortje, and very, very important. And so far, they've got away with Ben Stokes bowling in favourable positions. The one thing I would say is if you do look at this side, all the way through. So Sam Curran is not massively tested as a death bowler, but he's done very well. Mark Wood hasn't played enough T20 cricket, and I think he's been really good in his position. I'm not sure he'll be able to, bully the Indian batters the way he has with some of the others. And Ben Stokes is, it's not the first time that Ben Stokes has been used and looks like a bit of a weakness coming into the finals of a World Cup. The last time it ended very poorly with Carlos Brathwaite. Be very interesting to see what happens on this one. Adil Rashid just got the one wicket, although I reckon he's had at least one easy drop. I wonder if he's had a couple of drops, actually. But it hasn't gone for many runs, so they would prefer more wickets from him, of course. But because of Moeen Ali and Liam Livingstone, it gives them a really good depth of different spin options that they can have, even if they're not all completely first choice. Chris Woakes got hammered by Ireland, has been okay since then. But again, he hasn't played a great... it feels like Chris Woakes doesn't play T20 cricket all that much until suddenly England need him in a World Cup. And it's obviously more to do with injuries and who's available and everything else. But it is a bit of a concern for them coming in. If you just have a look at the ground, obviously England has not played at Adelaide before. To be fair, they've played cricket in Adelaide. Most of their players would have played. They've got a few Big Bash players as well, and international cricket. In fact, Adil Rashid, he played for South Australia and the Adelaide Strikers. I didn't know he played there for South Australia. That's a fun fact that Charlie's put in there. But obviously played for the Strikers. Alex Hales played there for the Strikers as well. Chris Jordan, I think, also played for the Strikers. And Phil Salt. So then they're going to know what this ground is like. Having said that, it's not particular. I mean, the thing with Adelaide is kind of everyone knows what it's like anyway. You've got short square boundaries, huge straight boundaries. The pitch is usually pretty true. It's fast. It does help spinners as well. And the ball can come onto the bat quite well there. Sometimes we do see in Adelaide that the steam goes out of the ball a little bit. I would assume, though, that's more often something that happens in the second in the reused pitches rather than the fresh pitches. As far as how they line up against India, this match seems like it will come down to which batting unit can outperform each other. And it's really interesting because they're very different kinds of batting units as well. We said coming into this tournament that England was the only team that could outbat teams as far as just make an extra, 1 run per over that other teams can't find. This hasn't been that kind of tournament so much. But also, the one thing I would say with England is, if they lose 3 or 4 early wickets, there's still so much batting and hitting talent to come after that, which is not quite the case with some of the other teams. But that's the kind of the strength of those situations there is quite interesting because it might be a battle of strength versus strength or weakness versus weakness, depending on how this game actually breaks. It's a possibility that England are going to bring in a bowler for Milan, who's obviously out because of his injury. Again, that shows the kind of flexibility they have. Someone asked me that question the other day, and I just thought they'd bring in another batting option. But the fact that they can do that does show you something else. I mean, to be fair, Jordan has a little bit in fact, Chris Jordan's batting has really improved. After years of being called an all-rounder and not making any runs, the last couple of years he's been quite good. And obviously David Willey can hit as well. Whether they'd use him as a pinch hitter in a game like this, I don't know. But he's an interesting player. So that's the end of the previews. We'll take a short break here, and then we'll do a little bit more on the tournament so far, and then I'll get into your questions.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
All right. Okay, we just got a couple of ones to finish with. Gunathilaka. Danushka Gunathilaka has been denied bail by Sydney court after being arrested and charged with 4 counts of sexual assault on Sunday. He's been ruled out of, he was already ruled out of the T20 World Cup with an injury, but he stuck around as a standby player. Not quite sure I understand why you'd be injured and sticking around. The SLC president, Shami Silva, told Cricinfo originally that they're supporting him. But he has been suspended from all forms of cricket. This is I think the 3rd or the 4th suspension that he's had for disciplinary breaches from Sri Lankan cricket. It is very important to remember that he is, of course, innocent until proven guilty, but it does not sound good for him at all. And I don't know if more information will come out in the next couple of days of everything else. But it's obviously a very sad story. It's not the first time that a player's got in trouble in a World Cup recently. There was a player for Afghanistan in the 2019 World Cup who I don't think he was done for assault, but there was certainly something involving a woman and a hotel room involved there. But there was also multiple breaches of different things. So we've had a couple of we certainly had a couple of things happen at World Cups recently, and it's very sad and not exactly what you want to be talking about at what is one of the most entertaining World Cups of all time, but it has happened. All right, let's move on to the last little section of the show, where let's start off with Michael Clarke's comments that Australia played un-Australian cricket. I so rarely react to former players talking nonsense, but hey, here we are. The most un-Australian word in the world is un-Australian because it pretends that Australia is a monoculture when really it's usually just used by dicks who don't like people doing things they don't like. I don't know why Muku has moved away from the graphics, but I'm sure we'll come back to them in a minute. And obviously, this is what Michael Clarke has called the Australian cricket team. Why? Because they didn't play the way he wanted. He said they picked an attacking team and they didn't actually play attacking cricket. Now, it would be easy here to do a cheap shot at Michael Clarke and say that he struck at 103 in his T20 international career, and he was a big part in why Australia was so ordinary. That would be the cheap shot. I'm going to go a slightly different way and say it wasn't that Australia didn't attack. It was that they weren't very good. In fact, is that the right graph? No, let me start here. This is the last World Cup that Australia won. You'll see this is the top run scorers in the tournament, and top right-hand corner is David Warner. So I think Josh Buttler averaged a bit more than him and struck at a slightly quicker rate. But Warner had the second most runs in the tournament, had a fantastic strike rate, right? If you go further back here, you'll also see, I almost said Jeff Marsh then. You'll see Mitchell Marsh, son of, back here, right? Again, he made, I think he made about 160, 170 runs and a huge strike rate. If you go forward to this World Cup, these are the leading run scorers for Australia. So Marcus Stoinis is batting at number 5 more often than not, and he's been the leading run scorer in Australia. They've only played 4 games, to be fair, but which is also the other thing that is worth mentioning. But if you look at Mitch Marsh and David Warner combined, they've actually made less runs combined than Marsh made on his own last time. When we talk about un-Australianness and not attacking enough and everything else, why don't we ever just say, do you know what? They played a bit shit. They weren't in great form. Finch made 100 runs at a strike rate of 110. Probably played 1 innings where he looked anything like the Aaron Finch that we know. Stoinis and Maxwell played some very good innings, but from too far down in the order at times. Maxwell probably didn't make quite enough runs. He was fine. Mitch Marsh got a couple of starts, but didn't quite go on. Tim David didn't play that much. But David Warner was the person who carried the batting last time, and he didn't make any runs, right? If David Warner had carried the batting again, Michael Clarke wouldn't be saying that. And they would be no or more un-Australian than they were otherwise. Also, the other thing that's worth mentioning is that this was a bowling World Cup. And specifically a seam bowling World Cup, and their 3 seam bowlers did not bowl particularly well. Hazelwood ended up with okay figures, but certainly a higher economy than you would expect from him, and he didn't have the kind of impact that you would expect Josh Hazelwood to have in this kind of tournament. Mitchell Starc was dropped. Pat Cummins also could have been dropped. Even their part-timers, and Kane Richardson when he came in, they bowled quite badly. They still won 3 games. But they didn't have quite the impact that they wanted to. One of the other things that I saw a couple of times was that people kept saying that Michael Clarke specifically said they didn't attack too much. But then Michael Vaughan said the old Australia against New Zealand would have made it to 140 or 150. You see, when you don't do proper analysis and you just give a half-hearted opinion, this is what happens. Right? You don't really think these things through. So let's have a look at those 2 comments separate. And these are 2 different people, don't get me wrong. Michael Clarke says that they didn't attack enough. Most people now look back at that New Zealand game and go, they were so far behind, what they should have done is chip the ball around and actually played a more defensive style of T20 cricket. That's the game that cost them. That's the game that cost them the net run rate and everything else, right? And yet we're in a situation where we're saying that. And then Michael Vaughan saying, oh, they should have just fought on to get 140 or 150 in that particular game against New Zealand. They were playing attacking brand of cricket and trying to get to it. There's no right answers. They weren't playing very good. Their top 3 did not make enough runs and did not have a positive impact on this tournament. And their 3 main seamers didn't. This is a power play led tournament. You want your top 3 probably to be within the runs, and you want your seamers to be firing. That's why Australia didn't do particularly well. Having said that, they still ended up with 3 wins and 1 loss. We haven't even got onto the fact that they weren't a very good death bowling team beforehand, and they're not a very good death bowling team now. I just want to point all that out. And the other thing I just want to say is, and again, I've got nothing against Michael Clarke. Every time I've met him, he's been nice and he was a fantastic player, but he was a terrible T20 player. And when I hear comments like this, it makes me go and have a look at Michael Clarke's record in T20 World Cups for Australia, where he averaged under 11. I almost said 11. It wasn't 11. He averaged under 11 while striking at 77. Australia didn't attack enough. It's just they didn't play very well. And these things happen. We saw the exact same thing with India in the last World Cup. India might yet win this tournament, right? And yet the last World Cup, they were an absolute laughingstock. They couldn't play T20 cricket. They didn't know what they were doing, right? It's exactly a very similar situation when you have a look at with Pakistan. Right. That's why I made the video about Pakistan and those 3 games, was to show how random these things are, what happens when form dips, and sometimes just what happens when you're in front in 3 games and somehow you manage to lose all those 3 games and what it does to your campaign. Although, to be fair, nothing can stop Pakistan. We've actually got to start doing proper analysis. And it really annoys me when someone who's a smart about, in fact, in Michael Vaughan's case and Michael Clarke's case, when they're a smart about cricket as we saw them be on the field, and then they say things like that they don't mean anything. It's just do a little bit of thinking and a little bit of research. Anyway, this is why I don't usually talk about former players, because it always goes shit like this, because I know that they're just asked their opinions and they're not thinking all these things through, and they say the first thing that comes to their mind. But Australia weren't very good, not because they were un-Australian. They weren't very good because their top order didn't make any runs, and their 3 main seam bowlers didn't actually take the sort of wickets that the Dutch seam bowlers did, right? The Zimbabwe seam bowlers did. That's why Australia didn't do particularly good in this tournament. And let's be honest and say what the real problems are, instead of vague bullshit like un-Australian and attacking and all that sort of nonsense. Anyway. Just wanted to talk. Just the last thing I wanted to bring up was Stefan Myburgh has retired from international cricket. I think I might have said that it was potentially his last. Well, certainly his last tournament. I might have even said his last game when he played the other day. I think it's great that he got to finish his career with one of the Dutch great wins, and he played such an important role in that. Taking South Africa down early on in that power play. He has made the Dutch sadly don't play a lot of international cricket, but he's in their top 6 run scorers of all time. He's been a stalwart for a long period of time, and also it was nice that they turned back to him at the end. They came into this tournament with lots of ideas of using their younger players. It didn't quite work, and they went back to the old fella, and he struggled in the first couple of games, but then came good when it mattered the most for Netherlands cricket, and was, he's going to finish his international career with what a game to be involved with, beating South Africa at a World Cup. And for those who don't know, he was just a very dependable top order player. Him and Max O'Dowd in partnership at times, but he was even dependable probably before Max O'Dowd became sort of the stalwart of that position. And both of them just play that sort of role, and allowing for what traditionally has been the sort of Netherlands rock star middle order of Roloff and Tom Cooper and Colin Ackerman and Ryan Tenterskata and those sorts of guys to come in and get all the plaudits. But you needed the new ball players to be quite handy to help those middle order guys, and they certainly were. And Myburgh had a really good career. I think he's about 38, so good on him for coming back, coming into the side for this last World Cup and putting in his all and being involved in that last win. That's the end of the written show. If you've got any questions, I've already got a couple of them. I think Muku will play an ad. Well, I'll go through and just see if there are any other comments or questions that I want to answer.
If you love the language of cricket and want more, then head over to the 99.94 app and you can hear all of our podcasts and cricket commentary. We're adding new shows all the time and covering cricket series from all over the world. Be the first to hear all of our announcements by following us on social media at 9994DM. Welcome to Cricket's Conversation.
All right, let's just see what else we have here. Okay. All right. Oh, I've got almost no questions. That's my fault. I'm sure I'll find a couple more. Here he is. Kanye Sunny says, is there anything positive South Africa can take from this World Cup? No one gets struck by lightning? Anything positive they could take from this World Cup? The bowling attack works, although it's getting old, isn't it? I thought Ngidi showed good flexibility as a thinker when it comes to bowling. Stubbs got some experience, I suppose. Riley Rousseau. Riley Rousseau is someone that I've been especially over the last couple of years when he really improved. But even before that, he would always pop up as a well above average player, and you obviously never got the chance to play in the major T20 leagues that much. And you look at his numbers and be like, wow, he's really good. He's obviously improved even more of recent times. I know he only made the 100, but if you look at his form over the last little while, and then him turning up at the World Cup and starting like that, I think we know that he is a legitimate talent for them, and it just seems like a player who works really hard. Other than that, I've got nothing. To be honest. Rahul says, why is Hardik Pandya not as destructive as before? Is it because he wants to be more of an anchor, or have bowlers figured out how to stop him from scoring quickly? He certainly wants to be more of an anchor. I mean, I haven't looked at his attack percentage, but I think I saw someone during the IPL say it was well down. I mean, if you watched him bat in that tournament, I think there was... you couldn't say that they'd worked him out. It was just the way that he was playing. I think he had a very... I did a podcast with Amol maybe a couple of months ago now about him, and I think he went through a bit of a maturity process. He also probably he had that injury and he started to think about his cricket a little bit differently. And I think there was a part of him that thought, well, I can actually bat properly as well. My problem with that is it's the third player from India now we've seen do that. I mean, Sky is like on his own. Rishabh became an anchor. KL Rahul became an anchor. I mean, just guys, if you can whack it an average 25 to 30 and you can get a strike rate of 155 plus, just do that. It's so useful. And if you then have the ability, it's a bit like Jofra Archer. That Jofra Archer bowled absolutely speed of light at Lords. And then he gets the heading lane. He's like, oh, this is a good pitch for seam bowling. I'm going to move it back. And I'm just going to bowl at 80, 83 miles an hour and seam it around everywhere. And you see that and you do start to think to yourself that is what you probably want up from a player like Hardik if he has those two gears available to him in a way that Andre Russell doesn't. He's never going to have that second gear, right? He's going to be in 8th gear or nothing. Whereas if Hardik does have the ability to be bat in 6th gear and bat in 3rd gear, that can be really, really handy. But when you decide to bat in 3rd gear, I find it really interesting. I've said this before. I think Australia and India specifically really push this that thing of being an anchor. And, Australia still hasn't really understood Glenn Maxwell and what he can do. And they still can't, they've been fighting it his whole career. You see Ricky Ponting get hold of Rishabh Pant and pull him back. KL Rahul gets into the Indian team and it seems to they almost put a leash on him. I think there's a real problem with the way that they're thinking. There's no problem with those players having those skills because I think this World Cup has proven that it's great to have hitters, but hitters can't handle 85 mile an hour wobble balls, and hitters can't handle the ball swinging both directions, and hitters can't handle the ball bouncing 4 inches higher than it should be, and all those sorts of things. So you do want other batting skills, but you don't want the players to go away from what they do naturally. As far as figuring him out, I haven't seen anyone suggest that. I haven't done a deep enough dive into his career, but it seems to me that it comes more from a natural part of it. Matchup's a bit overrated, Keshav asks. Nawaz didn't bowl a single over yesterday. Akshar at times doesn't bowl because doesn't bowl. Yesteryears, it was not unusual for SLA bowlers to bowl at lefties, offies to bowl at righties. Things have changed is the most important thing. So when you say yesteryear, one of the most important things is to go back and have a look at when that was. Because pre-DRS, it was very different. And the reason was LBWs were given differently. Spinners got wickets differently. And the way that you could play a spinner who was spinning the ball away from you with your pad was massively different than it is right now. So that is one reason. So it's very hard to get the ball-by-ball data of that sort of period just before DRS came in. But it does feel that there were a lot of players who suddenly became specialists against, a lot of off-spinners suddenly became specialists against left-handers in a way that they weren't before. The other thing is that when you say that they used to do it, the reason that they're not doing it is because we now have the numbers that can back us up, right? So someone can look at that player and they can say almost straight away, Akshar Patel is not particularly a great player against left-handers, so we're not going to do that. What teams are doing is they're putting it into their favor. And look, it's an interesting theory, and it doesn't always work. The thing about matchups is that I don't think fans understand is teams aren't saying that it is going to work every time. What you were saying is that there's a 60% chance that this guy is going to go for runs in this matchup. And if we bowl him in this matchup, there's a 40% chance he's going to go for runs. Over a long period of time, that will bear out. It doesn't mean it bears out in every individual game. Also, the other thing about, I think a lot of people talk about matchups, but they forget that quite often it's also about boundaries and wind, right? So you might have a player who, like Akshar might be fine against left-handers, but the only place to bowl him is going to be on this particular boundary. There's a left-hander facing and they're hitting with the wind, right? You also have to, factor in those sorts of things, or the short boundary or whatever it may be. So matchups, no one in cricket, I can't think of anyone in cricket who thinks of matchups as dogmatically as people outside of cricket think matchups are. It's almost impossible to even always get your matchups right, because you have two different batters at any one stage, and you have two different batters, and you send a guy out to get a good matchup, and the bowling team just changes who the bowler is, right? So I really think that, when you say our matchup's a bit overrated, I mean, I've said a few times that I think in certain situations, I don't think people get to the truth of the matchups, which is the bigger problem. But people talking about matchups being overrated is overrated. Deepak says, Indian openers have taken 10 balls to make the first run in 2 games. Can this cost them matches? Can batters be allowed to play the first over maiden when overall you only get 120 balls? I don't know if you've seen much of this tournament, Deepak, but the power play bowlers are absolutely destroying teams. I'm not sure this is the tournament I would be worried about this style, and I would say that they're doing it intentionally. I mean, part of it is, they might have run up against some good bowlers, and it might be that, they both are now classical anchors, Rohit and KL. So they're certainly going to be pushing the ball around a little bit more. But I do believe that it's probably a lot more to do with, it's probably a lot more to do with the fact that you have a situation where the ball's doing something and you don't want to lose early wickets. Also, India don't have a huge, deep batting lineup. Is it worth you being 15 off 10 balls and being 1 wicket down, or being no runs off 10 balls and being no wickets down? These are valid questions in this particular tournament. This is where I was going back to before, where you have to actually play to the tournament. And I think looking through all the better teams, I would say that India maybe have been the best team when it comes to actually adapting to each individual environment as they've come across it, more than anyone else. Some of that's just been dumb luck, because they have the right bowl. As I said, their bowling attack sort of fell in perfectly for what this tournament needed. But I also think that they probably adapted slightly better. You never want, no opening batter in T20 cricket goes out there hoping that they're not going to make a run off the first 10 balls, right? But you also have to react to the situation as it comes to you, and perhaps that's what's happening there. Sam Hazlitt said, I'm not sure he's the real one, but that's what his YouTube profile says. Cameron Green is not the answer in T20 cricket. Yeah, my big concern, whether he's the answer in T20 cricket, that's for the future, right? But the big thing that I have said from the start is this idea that Cameron Green would be in that side and it would be a successful World Cup side. We've seen a lot of young players being thrown up in World Cups and they haven't done stuff, and sometimes they have. He's really struggled in his T20 career until, 2.5 months ago. I think that if Finch wasn't captain, they probably would have picked Green. I wonder how Green would have played, though, because the wickets he was playing on and smashing the ball everywhere are nothing like the wickets in this tournament. So he would have come in and been told, you got to whack it, and then suddenly the ball would have been nibbling around everywhere, and that might have been a little bit trickier for him. So I think it's worth saying that he needs to play more T20 cricket. I mean, we get a lot of questions on here about him, and I keep saying the same thing. He just needs to play a lot more cricket. Let me see if there's anything else before we finish up. Actually, Muku, if you could play an ad, give me a second, and I'll just find anything. I like that question.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
All right, got a couple more questions and then we'll finish up. Where are we? Dinesh says, why have New Zealand used fewer bowlers? Oh, wait. Helps if I hit the thing, doesn't it? If one of their bowlers gets taken apart, which extra bowler should they turn to, Neesham or Mitchell? They've also got Glenn Phillips. Because the bowlers haven't been taken apart, I suppose, is part of the reason. I think we've seen a movement in Test cricket, specifically, of teams moving more and more towards their frontline bowlers. Part-time bowlers aren't as important. And there's many reasons why people don't use part-time bowlers as much. One is that batters don't spend as much time in the nets bowling as they used to. You know, from the throwdown era to the net bowler era, it's not like in the old days where the test batters would bowl a couple of overs, keep their eye in. Quite often, unless they're expecting to bowl, they won't bowl that much in the nets. I'm not sure if that's come over to T20 cricket specifically, being that New Zealand's the only team that has done it. New Zealand have a very well-balanced bowling lineup. I'm not sure I've seen them in a game yet where I've thought, this would be a good time for the... other than perhaps Phillips. Phillips is the only one occasionally, and he's not a very good bowler. He's very part-time. He's fine. He's good at what he does, but he's not frontline. Phillips has been the only one occasionally where I thought, this would be handy here. I'm not sure they've played in conditions where I've thought that Mitchell or Neesham has needed to bowl yet. And clearly they have felt the same. From your perspective, if one of their bowlers gets taken apart, which extra bowler should they turn to? So it's just conditions based, right? If you want something where you probably want a seamer, then you probably want Neesham. If it's early on, obviously Mitchell can really swing the ball, or you can probably get away with the cheeky 7th over from Mitchell as well. And then you have Phillips for the off spin, whatever underspin type bowling that he bowls as well. Vickers says, we're not seeing the old 90s slogging by coming down the ground. It was so entertaining when Lytton Das was doing it. So the reason that players don't do it is because it's a bit like why golfers don't do what Happy Gilmore does. It is much harder to hit a ball if your head is moving around. And I think that when we saw that in the 90s, it was before batters knew about power bases and core strength. And before, in the 90s, that was actually before we had range hitting. It was really before Lance Klusener brought range hitting into the game. All those sorts of things. The bats have changed. The batters have changed. So they're a lot stronger now. So they don't probably need that momentum running up. There are still some players who do like to do it. And it can bother some bowlers with length as well. But I think we've seen that the better way to hit is to keep your head straight, get a wide power balance, stance, and hit from that. So that's why the game has changed from that particular style of hitting. Rama says, what do you think of an IPL where you either need to play 7 out of 11 Indian players or 6 Indian players and 1 associate nation player? So I wrote about this in 2008, that I thought the IPL had a real chance to win over the associates, also to help them. But if you have a look, it's been really interesting over the years of seeing Rashid Khan and Sandeep Lamachani in Australia, and you've got to throw Majib in there as well, of players who have helped the Big Bash with a new way of marketing themselves to, it makes them look, more aware of society. It makes them look like they're helping out. Gives a different kind of player to have a look at than the standard kinds of players that you see, in cricket. All those sorts of things, I think work really, really well. So it's not just an idea that just works from a cricket perspective. Also, that you can then form partnerships with these countries, right? Help them with their developing of their talent. You could have a system. Let's say you had an associate system. Some of these IPL teams would be like, great, well, let's invest in 2 or 3 different countries. So the overall standard of cricket would grow. So yeah, it would be great. It's not going to happen. I did once interview to be the IPL general manager. Is that the title? Something like that. And that was one of the things that I said that they could do, which would improve I mean, I think it could improve world cricket. It would make them look like they're got a heart of gold. It would also give them, great marketing opportunities and other things going ahead. But I didn't get the job, and I'm not sure who did get the job in the end. But I don't think I would have got that through anyway. But it would have been nice to have a proper meeting about it. Vix KSR says, "Can cricket compete with football in Europe? And what steps should be taken to promote it?" I don't think that's the right way to think about these things anyway. I don't think you should be saying cricket has to compete as much with Minecraft bloggers, or not bloggers, what are they? YouTubers, streamers, Twitch streamers, as it does with football. And I think that, football is bigger and Minecraft twitching is maybe bigger in Europe. I don't know. Is twitching a thing? I think it is. It is now. So from that perspective, that's not how you look at that. We've had chances with cricket in Europe before. Obviously, if you want to go back and see my podcast on Denmark cricket, Denmark produced a bunch of professional cricketers and should probably be a test playing nation, but no one in cricket gave a shit. And Netherlands could have been promoted a lot more over the years. Ireland and Scotland as well. There was a brief moment where we all thought Germany cricket was going to be quite good. Spanish cricket, Italian cricket, there's stuff going on in European cricket. It's not really about getting it as big as football, because I don't think it ever will be, but also I just think that's the wrong way of looking at it. The right way of looking at it is how do sports grow in all these countries? That's the best way to look at these things. But the truth is that no one in at the ICC is sitting there with a master plan of how to make cricket big in Europe. That's just not what they do. It's not what the ICC is set up to do. The ICC is set up to host these events and make sure that the umpires have an Emirates logo on their kit. So if cricket was run correctly by a global body who were completely in charge of the game and had access to finances and everything else, and actually wanted to actively grow the game, I think you'd probably go to some of those places that had remnants of cricket. And then you maybe look, as I said, some of the other countries in how sports have grown there over the last 20 years and how sports get popular in different regions. It's the best way to make your sport. You have a look at what Major League Cricket is doing in America. They're not copying what cricket does in other places. They're very specifically going, how does sport work in America? So then how can we make it work for us and cricket? That's the only way to do it. And you have to do that on an individual basis, and it takes time and it takes money and it takes intelligence. And, cricket doesn't really always have all those three things at the one time. Anyway, thank you very much. We'll be back tomorrow with another show, and I'm not sure if we'll look specifically at the other final. At the first semi-final, but there's a metric I really want to look at with these teams to show you where their strengths and weaknesses are and how they play specifically. So hopefully I'll be able to bring that one over tomorrow for you if I get the time. But there should also be tomorrow morning a video, fingers crossed, on South African cricket and their history at the World Cup. So bring your tissues for that one, and we'll see you again tomorrow for another World Cup Mood Board Live. Thanks to 99.94.